But the Ukrainians are in this fight, and they sense all along that Russia has more vulnerabilities than we think.
Keir Starmer believes that a deal to release up to £100 billion for Ukraine is just days away. To give you some context, the whole UK defence budget is £60 billion. That money would come from frozen Russian assets. So could Ukraine use Russia's own money to change the conflict and perhaps get a better peace deal? John Lough used to work for NATO in Moscow and is now head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. That's a think tank set up by an opponent of Vladimir Putin. He joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
How significant would £100 billion be for Ukraine's war efforts?
It would be very significant indeed. Ukraine's public finances are in dire shape as a result of the excessive investment now in defense. They're spending over 30% of GDP fighting this war. And if they don't receive further external financial assistance, the state is going to run out of money in April. So this is absolutely critical for keeping Ukraine afloat, and not just that, for keeping it actually fighting this war. So European states have been discussing this issue now for several months, and they are struggling to find a formula that will allow them to release this money that's currently held in Belgium. So these are Russian sovereign assets that were seized at the start of the war. And what the Belgians are worried about is that the Russians are going to come after them illegally. So they want insurance, if you like, from the other EU member states that they'll be covered in that eventuality. But for Ukraine, this is absolutely critical.
And is it critical just in the financial sense, or is it also critical in the sense that it shows that Europe is finally sort of getting serious about taking on some of the accusations that Donald Trump has levelled at European leaders? I mean, he's reposted overnight the only comment that he's made about the talks in Downing Street between Zelensky and the EU leaders, reposting an article which calls European states impotent in this conflict. Is it as much about that as it is about the money?
Well, I think it's certainly a test, if you like, a litmus test of Europe's willingness, if you like, to really roll up its sleeves and support Ukraine in a very substantial way. That's not to say that it's done nothing so far, but a little bit like the US support, it's been tentative. It's always felt as though the Europeans, like the Americans, haven't really wanted Ukraine to win this war. They somehow wanted it to blunt Russia's aggression, force Putin to the table, and then have some compromise worked out. Whereas I think this is now a real responsibility for Europe, in the absence of the United States, to now sort of step up and help Ukraine through this next critical phase of the war, because it really feels as though we have entered a new phase of the war where the Americans are determined to try to impose some sort of settlement on Ukraine, and a settlement that looks unjust. And the Europeans understand that very well, and in their own way are trying to fight their corner. And this meeting yesterday of Starmer, Zelensky, Merz and Macron was a good example of that. There's some sort of pushback coming. But they're pushing back against really a very strong effort by the Trump administration to get a peace agreement over the line. But the irony here is that the Americans don't want these frozen assets simply transferred to Ukraine. They have other plans for them. They want to set up some sort of direct investment fund, part of which will be funded by a portion of those sovereign assets. So they want to do this together with the Russians. So from what we know, the Americans have been putting pressure on the Belgians, and in fact others, not to release those funds. So I think the Trump administration actually here has something of a conflict of interest.
So in a way, both conflicts are coming to a head. We have the deal between Ukraine and Russia, and whatever happens there, whether it is this new peace plan that we understand that the Zelensky team and the EU team are ready to present to America, or the American deal. But also at the same time as that, you've got the European leaders and the Americans on a collision course here over really the future of their relationship over the coming months and years.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So we've seen this new US national security strategy published on Friday, which has really very harsh words about Europe, and accuses Europe of a whole number of things, and even warns of its civilizational erasure. So this is very much the language of J.D. Vance, and it's as you suggested earlier. I think the implication here is that Europe has somehow become impotent, unable to act, and has become a liability in its own way. So this American administration feels that it does have a responsibility to bring this war in Ukraine to an end, because he sees otherwise that the war could spread and there could be a wider war between Europe and Russia. So by some measure, one can say that it is important actually the US is getting involved and trying to find a way to stop the war. But the problem is it hasn't been prepared to put the Russians under real pressure. Trump finds it much easier to, in fact, pressure Zelensky. And this pressure comes sort of regularly. And just yesterday, he was saying that Zelensky is basically being unhelpful. He hasn't read the peace plan. His staff are happy with what they've been discussing with the United States, which is all actually very hard to imagine, because the real sticking point here for Zelensky is that of security guarantees. He's being asked to give up territory by the Americans, territory that Ukraine currently controls, in order to bring this conflict to an end, without so far receiving something substantial in return. And he could only ever contemplate doing that. He would have to go to a national referendum. They'd have to change the constitution to adjust the borders. He could only ever contemplate doing that if Ukraine were to get some really substantial guarantee from the United States and its allies that if Russia were to try to come again and grab more territory or undermine Ukraine's stability even further, that the Western allies would stand by it, and particularly the Americans would stand by it, because the Europeans are not going to do that without some sort of American backstop.
And we do believe that America is not ready to and willing to put up those kinds of guarantees. So, John, in your experience, I mean, given your vast experience of this region, what do you think will happen now? What do you think are the next steps here?
I think the next steps are that the Trump administration is going to try very, very hard to impose something on the Ukrainians. They're going to threaten to withdraw intelligence support again. They're going to threaten to stop arms sales to the Europeans who are currently buying armaments for Ukraine to keep it in this war. And they will probably come up with some rather vague formula in terms of security assurances, which I fear won't be satisfactory either for the Ukrainians or the Europeans. And so this has, I have a horrible sense that this war is simply going to continue. And in many ways that suits Putin's purpose, because he believes that he can simply defeat Ukraine because he's got the larger economy, greater manpower, all these things. But the Ukrainians have been fighting for nearly 4 years. The Russians thought the war would be over in 2 years. And 2 weeks, excuse me. And I suspect the war will simply continue with potentially disastrous consequences for Ukraine if it were to just continue endlessly. But the Ukrainians are in this fight, and they sense all along that Russia has more vulnerabilities than we think. It doesn't have, I think, sufficient economic vulnerabilities. We saw a mutiny in Russia, in 2023, when somebody dissatisfied with the war, Mr. Prigozhin, started to march on Moscow, and that could have really destabilized the Russian system, and I think even have led to the overthrow of Putin if it had continued. So there are black swans out there, but relying on black swans to bring this war to an end, I think, is naive.
John, thank you very much for your time this morning. That is John Lough there, who used to work for NATO in Moscow, now head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. What
I think is so interesting about that, it's clarified something in my mind as I was listening to it, is that we are clearly coming to a point at which we have to have a proper break with America or not. Because what the European diplomatic effort is to worry about America and probably amongst themselves to deplore America, but in public and to Trump to flatter and to say, oh, no, we're still on board. But if Trump doesn't want this money to go, this 100 billion to go to Ukraine, if Trump doesn't want a fair deal for Ukraine, and Europe does. At some point,
you have to break.
And that can't be just done by saying, which is the Starmer method, and he gets a lot of praise for this method, Starmer, and maybe it's even the right thing to do, but where you carry Trump along with you and you use woolly words and you make gestures and you go and crook the knee at the White House. But if you do that, all you do is retain the status quo. We just go bumbling on and on and on and on.
It's coming to a point, isn't it?
At some point you need to say, America thinks X and Y, and fundamentally Europe thinks A and B, therefore we are no longer aligned with America.
There are difficult questions, though, if we do that. And you can see the front page of the Daily Mail today. You can see some of the very, very difficult questions directed at this government about defence spending.
Do we have enough money?
Well, it's about commitment too. It's not just about money. It is about money, but it's also about commitment. I mean, they are supposed to have a defence industrial strategy published published by the summer and then got delayed to the autumn. Then we were told by the end of this year. There is now a suggestion that that won't be published till 2026. You know, if the government is serious about this, and if we really are in that precarious a position, you can understand why really very senior defence figures are now saying enough is enough here.